first workshop. Susan teaches translation in Kobe College Department of English. She has over 20 years. I can tell your age, Susan. I thought you probably start at 5. Susan teaches translation in Kobe College Department, and she has over 20 years of translation experiences. She instructs both theory and practice with a focus on the machine translation. Wow, have you ever wondered like how your student and why your student use translation app? Like for me, I always think about like why they use the app so often in their writing. And here today, Susan is going to share some idea for incorporating machine translation in class for us today, giving us a lot of practical idea that we can immediately use next week in class. Well, teachers, let's welcome Susan Jones.
Thank you very much for your welcome. I appreciate that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get right into my presentation. While I'm presenting, feel free to make comments in the chat if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation, or if I see them in the chat in time, I'll answer at that time. But if not, I will certainly answer your questions in English at the end of the presentation today. Okay, so hang on just a moment. All right, could somebody tell me if you can see my presentation right now?
Okay, yes.
You
yes.
can see it? Okay,
yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so that is the title of my presentation today, Machine Translation in College Classrooms. Welcome. First, I'll tell you just a little bit more about myself. As was mentioned in my introduction, I am a teacher of translation at Kobe College in Nishinomiya, Japan. And I'm also a translator with over 20 years experience doing both literary translation and commercial translation. Most of my background, most of my experience has been in commercial translation. So I'm here, in case you're wondering, I'm in Western Japan. So I'm not close to Tokyo, I'm close to the city of Osaka, if you're familiar with Osaka. And before we start talking about how you can use machine translation in your own classroom, I'd first like to talk a little bit about machine translation itself and make sure that we're talking about the same thing when we talk about machine translation. And just to give you a little bit of background about machine translation, where does it come from, and how are we using it today? So there are many types. There are several types of machine translation, but one of the earliest types was developed in the 1970s. It was called rule-based machine translation, or RBMT. And basically, in this system, what they did was they programmed the software with all of the rules of a language. So if it was English, they put in all of the syntax rules, the morphological rules, the lexical rules, all the grammatical rules and rules of the language they would input into the software. And then they would do that for another language. And then they matched the languages up and it would produce a translation. Often these translations were not very fluent, and they also had a lot of trouble translating things like idioms or humor, things like that. So for very rough translations, this worked pretty well. The nice thing about RBMT is that you can match up many different languages. As soon as you have all the rules of one language input, then you can match it up with any other language for which the rules are also input. So in a way, it's pretty flexible. After that, in the late 1980s, came the advent of statistical machine translation, SMT. And this is the basis upon which our current machine translation works. So in statistical machine translation, instead of inputting a bunch of rules, grammar rules, what it does is it takes a corpus, a huge collection of translations, translated texts, and inputs them into the system. After it does that, when you input the text you want it to translate, it refers back to that corpus, and it says, well, you know, it was translated this way in a certain way 9 times out of 10 before. So probably statistics show us that it's probably going to be this translation again. And so that is the translation it will give us. It is actually computation. It is not actually able to think or to reason. It's actually just translating based on computation. And then we have the advent of NMT, or neural machine translation. As I mentioned, it's quite similar to SMT. It's based on SMT. It's the same kind of system, except it can do a little bit extra. Just like in SMT, the system or the software is loaded with a corpus of correctly translated source text and target text. And then the new source text is translated according to the prior translations. That's the same as SMT. But in NMT, it also learns and updates according to newly input translated pairs. So it uses an encoder decoder with attention mechanism to encode and then decode the source text. It works just a little bit differently, but the basic idea is the same as SMT. It's SMT plus alpha. It also learns, it updates as you use it. So the more we use NMT, the better it gets. It improves over time. You can see here that NMT really hit the public awareness around 2014, and this is what all of our current machine translation is based on these days. So those apps that your students are using, or maybe you are using, those are all NMT. Okay, so you can see there has been quite a progression, and machine translation has been around for a long time. The difference is now it's really accessible, and the level of the translation is actually quite good. And this is the thing that other teachers are asking me about. They're saying, hey, Susan, you teach translation. How good is this software? Well, it's really good. So let's take a look at some typical or common machine translation engines. In Japan, these are the 2 most commonly used machine translations, Google Translate and DeepL. Google Translate was probably on the scene a little bit earlier than DeepL. So I think a lot of people are more familiar with Google Translate, but in terms of Japanese to English and English to Japanese, actually DeepL is much better. There is also a Microsoft application as well, a Microsoft translator, and Amazon also has its own proprietary translator, and Mirai Translate also has a proprietary translator. I'm going to stop there for just a second because I would like to ask you specifically, sorry, I just switched screens so that I can see some faces. I'm wondering, how many of you suspect that your students are using machine translation in the classroom? Or not in the classroom, but for their homework, maybe if you assign them an essay or a paper to write in English. Okay, 1 person raised the hand. Anybody else? I just want to see how many people. Oh my goodness, so many. Oh my goodness. Okay. So quite a few of you suspect or maybe even know for sure that your students are using machine translation. I agree. I believe that a lot of students are using machine translation, but I don't think it necessarily has to be a bad thing. Now, I teach translation, so you can trust me on this. For many years in my translation classes, I always told my students, do not use machine translation. 一切使わないで. I would tell them, never ever use machine translation. Because number 1, it's not good enough. It's just not good enough. And number 2, I can tell. I can see the kinds of mistakes it makes. I can tell that you're not translating it I want you to learn how to translate. I want you to learn how to write well. And I didn't feel like machine translation was a big help. But now things are a little bit different. Okay, let me go back to my presentation here. Okay, so now I can't see you guys anymore. All right, so actually students are really powerless to resist the temptation of using these tools that they have literally in their pocket, right? They have cell phones, they have smartphones, they have tablets, they have computers, they have devices with them on their body pretty much 24 hours a day. So it's really, really difficult for them to refrain or to not use the machine translation apps. So some teachers will ask me, how can I catch my student who is using machine translation? I want to catch them. Well, I'm going to give you a few things, a few clues that you can look for if all you're trying to do is catch your student using machine translation. Sometimes it can be really difficult to prove, but if you suspect your student is using machine translation and you don't want them to, these are some things to look for. So number one, the writing is too good to be true. This is probably the biggest indicator that your student is using machine translation. So one way to combat this is to require a brief in-class timed writing task at the beginning of the semester, so you have a base. You know your student's level, and you collect that and you keep it. You know what their writing level is like. If later they hand in something that is 10 times better than that initial writing, you know that probably they're using some outside assistance. Number two, machine translation does a really bad job with proper nouns. So it often doesn't recognize them. It may not have the proper noun in its dictionary yet, in its term base, in its history of translations. It might be a brand new proper noun. It just doesn't have it in its memory systems or its memory bank. So proper nouns are often mistranslated, and that's a good thing to look for. Another thing is using the incorrect pronoun. Now, this is something that's particularly noticeable in Japanese to English translation. I'm not really sure that this one would also be a clue for you in Chinese to English translation. I don't know enough Chinese to know whether this would be a recurring problem. You might be able to tell me that a little bit better. Number four, the number is often incorrect. Singular and plural is not as clear in Japanese. It's not as clearly defined. Usually we know singular or plural depending on context, depending on the way it's used in a sentence. But in English, as you know, we must make it very clear by the verbs we use, whether something is singular or plural. So the machine translation often gets that wrong. A few other points to look for are repetitions. This is something that my students notice this as well, especially DeepL, but Google Translate is the same. It tends to repeat either entire sentences or segments, like a block of text. It will repeat that within the translation output. This is a sort of calculation mistake. They're not doing it, the software is not doing that in order to give you another option for translation. That's something else entirely. This is actually a mistake, a repetition in the output that shouldn't be there. And this is a glitch. This is something that hopefully will get better as machine translation technology improves. Number six is another one that I'm not really sure is going to be a problem in Chinese to English translation. In Japanese, these are Japanese, what we call kagi kakko. They're like quotation marks, but they're used in a more broad sense. They're used more broadly than English quotation marks. So when they're translated by machine translation, they are directly translated as quotation marks every single time, which is not the correct usage in English. So again, this may not pertain to Chinese to English machine translation. Number 7, the subject of the sentence being incorrectly identified. I believe this is also the case in Chinese, that often the subject of a sentence is implied. It is not explicit. It is not written out in the Chinese or the Japanese, but it must exist in English in order for the sentence to be a sentence. And DeepL or Google Translate or these apps often misidentify the correct subject of the sentence. So that's another clue. Finally, if your students are just inputting their text and copying and pasting the output, the translation, at the bottom of their copy and paste, there may be a line that looks like this, saying that they've used the DeepL translator, the free version of the DeepL translator, and they may forget to erase that. That's pretty much definitive proof that they have used a translation app. So if you're just trying to catch your students, these are some points that you can look for in their writing. But as I stated at the beginning of this presentation, oh, wait a second. In Chinese to English, some other mistakes you might look for are incorrectly translated idioms. Strange word order often comes up. The word order tends to be different, a little bit different in Chinese to English. And also this has come up in a couple of papers that I just looked at this week, actually, about the translation of de in Chinese, translating it from Chinese to English. Apparently it has a broader meaning than simply possessive. When I learned very elementary Chinese, I only learned one usage of de, and that was possessive. My teacher, my brother, my sister, that kind of possessive. But apparently it's used more widely in Chinese, and machine translation often makes a mistake with that. So again, those are some things to look at. But my contention today is that we can actually use machine translation to help our students improve their writing and also increase the amount of text analysis and increase the writing output that our students do. So students will be shocked the first time you tell them, hey, guess what? I really want you to use machine translation, but here's the catch. I want you to use it thoughtfully. I want you to use it mindfully, and I want you to use it as a tool, not as a means for getting a perfectly written essay or paper. So the workflow that we're aiming for with the machine translation in the classroom looks like this. So the first thing that we'll want students to do is pre-edit their Chinese text if they're working Chinese to English. And this means that they need to either write their own text, or they need to take their source text that they're going to translate and rewrite it in order to help the machine translation produce a better translation. Now, it's going to be difficult for them to pre-edit until they've had some experience using machine translation. So I usually skip the pre-edit step until the end because I want them to see how a pre-edit can help the machine translation do a better job. So I usually do this exercise with my students last, but in the natural flow of work that we hope students will use in the future, the pre-edit stage will come first. And they'll do things like break long sentences into shorter sentences, because machine translation does a much better job with shorter sentences rather than long, complex sentences. They can add pronouns and the subjects of sentences which might be missing or unclear. And they can also remove or rewrite rhetorical questions, which is something that comes up a lot in Japanese. Japanese text tends to include a lot of rhetorical questions like, don't you think so? And isn't that right? Whereas in English, it sounds a little bit amateurish. It doesn't sound very professional to include those in our writing. So those are 3 examples of things that you can change in the pre-edit stage. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Then the student would take his or her pre-edited text in their L1, in their first language, in their Chinese, and then put it into the machine translation engine of their choice. So Google Translate, DeepL, Mirai Translate, whatever they're using. And then comes the really fun part, the post-editing stage. And I actually break the post-edit down into 3 distinct chapters. The first assignment will be to correct any repeated text or dropped text. So with the repeated text, I already told you, machine translation tends to repeat segments of text sometimes. It makes this mistake. So they need to look for those mistakes and delete them. And they also need to look out for dropped text. This is something that the machine translation skipped over, something that didn't get translated. Sometimes that happens. It's not a perfect system. So in the first stage, that's what they're doing. In the second stage, they'll conduct another line-by-line comparison to detect other translation errors. So for example, proper nouns or singular and plural, the number, those are all things that could be changed at this stage. Then in the third stage, I actually tell them to put aside that source text. Don't look at your Chinese text or your Japanese text, your L1 text, and rewrite your final text without looking at the source text. So at this stage, it's going to be formatted and written for fluency in English for the audience that they're trying to convey the information to in English. So I'd like to go through these steps one by one so you can see what these stages look like in the post-editing stages. And this would be the first thing that we would do before we start the pre-edit or post-edit or anything. The first thing we want to do is we want to get our students buy-in. We want students to understand that machine translation is not perfect. And we want them to understand the types of mistakes that machine translation makes. So going back, if they understand the type of mistakes that machine translation makes, they can do a pre-edit more effectively in the future, okay? But for the first time you do this kind of exercise with your students, I really recommend that you go through this process of finding the errors, error detection in a machine translation. This is something you can all do together. This could easily be an in-class activity that you do in class. So I kind of made this this key, this color-coded key, and I have students go through the translation and highlight the mistakes. For example, if something is incorrectly translated, using the wrong spelling or the wrong word is used. If something is unnatural, maybe it's grammatically correct, but it sounds unnatural, or maybe it's grammatically incorrect. Incorrect punctuation, machine translation does a terrible job with punctuation. It often adds extra punctuation that's not necessary. So they need to go through and highlight all of those punctuation mistakes, sometimes missing punctuation. And this pink one is for an incorrect subject or reference. So if the machine translation says he, but it actually should have been she instead, then that should be highlighted in pink. So let's take a really quick look at what that looks like. So this was the source text I chose for my students to use. My students are all Japanese students, so their source text is in their L1, their first language. Their source text is in Japanese, and this is a very short news article. You probably recognize some of the kanji, even if you don't read Japanese. That's not a problem for our purposes today. This is a news article about the postponement of a performance of Kasai No. This is Japanese No theater being performed in Kasai. For 2 years in a row, it's been postponed because of COVID. So it's a very short article, but I chose this article on purpose for a couple of reasons. Number one, I wanted an article that had a lot of proper nouns. So this has a ton of proper nouns. Hyogo Prefecture, Kasai City, COVID-19, Kasai No, Kasai City, the titles, Nehime, Bo Shibari, and Kuzu. These are all titles of performances, of plays, and also some other people's names, and of course the writer's name. So we have lots and lots of proper nouns. So I wanted my students to have a lot of proper nouns to deal with. I also wanted to choose something that I knew the machine translation wouldn't do a very good job with besides proper nouns, and that is something culturally specific. So if you're going to do this exercise with your students, I recommend choosing something that is very culturally specific to their L1 culture. In this case, this has to do with Japanese traditional performance, Japanese traditional theater. And that's not something that the machine translation is going to be able to finesse in any way, and it will need finessing in the end. The third reason I chose this is because it is a news article, and news articles are formatted quite differently in Japanese than they are in English. One example of that is down here at the bottom. We can see this is the author's name. This is the writer's name. In English, we wouldn't put that at the end. We would usually put that at the beginning of the news article, right here under the title. We would put the author's name. So there are some formatting considerations in a news article that I also wanted my students to be aware of. So let's look at that first post-editing stage. Let me just review for you, going back. Our first post-editing stage is to do a line-by-line comparison to look for repeated text or drop text. So this is what it would look like in the Google translated version. I gave my students both Google Translate and DeepL translation so that they could compare and see which one was better. But they went through and did this error detection exercise on both of them. You can see the blue is for punctuation and the yellow is for mistranslations. They've missed a lot of the proper nouns. This is an unnatural translation here. New coronavirus. We don't usually say that in English. The pink is the incorrect pronoun or incorrect subject here. So lots and lots of mistakes. And then I also gave them the translation from DeepL using the DeepL translator. Still quite a few mistakes, but not quite as many as the Google Translate. So then after they've detected these errors, then they go on to those post-editing steps, assignments 2 through 4. Assignment 1 is the error detection. Assignment 2 is the line-by-line comparison for repeated or dropped text. Assignment 3 is the line-by-line comparison looking for these translation errors. And then the fourth assignment is to rewrite the text without looking at the source text and formatting it appropriately for the intended purpose. Let's take a look at what that looks like. I asked my students to use, we call it in Japanese, henko rireki. In English, it's called markup, right? Markup or track changes. I think if you're using a Macintosh, an Apple computer, it's called markup. And if you're using a Windows machine, it will say track changes. So I had my students use track changes so that I could see exactly what they were changing. There weren't really too many things to change here. There were some extra quotation marks and a couple of things like that. There was an addition that needed to be made here, but there wasn't too much to change at this stage. Then the next stage was looking for actual mistakes. Proper nouns like this. The way we write the titles of plays, we usually write them in italics in English, and the spelling is changed here a little bit. The verb tense is cleaned up. Again, proper nouns and proper nouns. They had to go through and they had to check every single proper noun, make sure it was translated correctly, and some of them were not. And then this is the final stage, the final formatting stage and rewriting stage. And this one is really crucial. So at this point, their final writing should look like something that was originally written in English. We shouldn't see any clue that it was ever used in machine translation, that they ever used machine translation. So you can see that I've changed the format. I highlighted the title and I put the author's name, the journalist's name here at the top. I also put the word yesterday instead of the date, because in English, we don't usually say on April 26th. You can see that April 27th is the date of this news item. So we don't usually say on April 26th, we say yesterday, because it is actually yesterday. So those are some things that they had to study about an English article. What does an English news article look like? And they had to correct that. We also do things like sometimes we will make additions as necessary. So in this case, our topic is no theater. And even though it's about no theater, in this article, they mention Kyogen theater, Kyogen, 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 Kyogen. It comes up 4 times in this article. But unless the reader really understands Japanese theater, they don't understand why the article is talking about Kyogen when the title says it should be no. So we need an additional sentence here just to let the reader know, what is Kyogen? Why are we suddenly talking about Kyogen when the topic was supposed to be no? So we added the sentence, serious no plays are usually interspersed with short comedic Kyogen plays. Okay. So now we know that Kyogen is often performed along with no. That's a really important point. We also rewrite for natural expressions. This particular sentence was really oddly phrased in the original machine translation, and so we rewrote it to make it sound more natural. This one here, we changed the word order a little bit. It said last year, and then at the end of the sentence it said in July. You can see here in this sentence, last year in July. So last year and in July are separated by a lot of space. There's a lot of sentence in between them. It's much more natural and makes a lot more sense to just say last July instead of last year, in July. So you can see that all of this looks totally natural now in English. The formatting is correct. Odd phrases are rewritten. And at this stage, students have looked at, analyzed, and rewritten this text 3 times. Okay, so I think we can no longer call this text a machine translation. It is the student's translation at this point, or it is the student's writing at this point, because they've actually had to extensively rewrite this in order to make it understandable and in order to make it appropriate for their audience. Now, since they went through all of the error detection process, what we can then talk to them about is that pre-editing stage that I mentioned earlier. And some things that they can look for in the pre-editing stage are reducing the sentence length. If you have really long sentences, you should make them shorter. Making sure each sentence is a complete sentence, not a fragment of a sentence. Machine translation does much better with complete sentences. Unify the terminology. So if the source text talks about no and then suddenly switches to kyogen, let's make it clear why it's switching, or make it all the same. Make sure the spelling and punctuation are correct in the source text, because if spelling and punctuation are incorrect in the source text, of course it's going to make a mistake in the translation. Simplify the grammatical structures. This kind of goes to reducing the sentence length. Usually if you reduce the sentence length, you'll also be simplifying the grammatical structures. Adding or clarifying pronouns and adding subjects. So if it's not clear, adding a he or a she or a we or a they, or adding a subject if the subject is only implied in the source text. I will say that machine translation usually makes a mistake in favor of the male pronouns, he or him or his, because if we think back to the way machine translation works, neural machine translation is based on what has been previously translated and input into the system. And the corpus of writing, at least in English, I can say this is true, the corpus of English writing includes more writing by men and about men than it does by women and about women. So statistically speaking, it makes more sense for the machine translation to say, oh, we're not sure of the subject, so let's make it he or his or him. All right, so there is a reason for that, and that's because the basis upon which the machine translation is built already includes this gender bias. We can also do things like removing ambiguities. So if you have a play on words or jokes, humor, idioms, those are all things that machine translation does a really bad job on. So I recommend either eliminating those or rewriting them so they're no longer a metaphor or an idiom. And as I mentioned earlier, you can delete rhetorical questions as well. This especially applies to Japanese text. We also tend to use more active voice than passive voice in English. So if you change all of the passive voice constructions in the source text to active voice, then your machine translation will not need as much post-editing. And finally, we can adjust the format. So in the case of the article that we just looked at, you could move the name of the writer, of the author, and move that up to the top so it's in the right place. Okay, so next, I just want to review that machine translation writing workflow, which I introduced at the beginning of the session, and that was pre-editing, translating with machine translation, and then going through 3 stages of post-editing. Okay, so hopefully your students can actually go through 1, 2, 3, 4 stages of writing, either in their L1 and in their L2. And I'm going to give you an optional final assignment that you can give them, and that is to use a grammar checker. One of the most commonly used grammar checkers online is called Grammarly, but there are many free grammar checks that can be used online. These are free applications. Grammarly is really nice because we can set the level of the text. We can say it's for a general audience, or it's a neutral formality, or it's very formal. We can set the domain, the type of writing that it is, and we can also set the tone of the writing, and it will check our text according to these goals. So in the case of our news article, I put that in, and it did give me the suggestion of changing this phrase with the aim of performing, and it suggests to perform or intending to perform. And it says it may be wordy. Yes, that is true. I totally agree. And this is my bad habit. So I'm going to replace it with to perform. But by students having to actually read their text again and look at more mistakes that they might not have realized before. This gets them to read and rewrite their text one final time for a final polish. So I do recommend that if they have time to do this, that they take advantage of these free grammar checkers. All right, and so what I want to do is really encourage you to try this with your students, and let me know how it goes. I'd love to hear back from you. If you want to drop me an email, this is my email address. I'm at jones@mail.kobe-c.ac.jp. I would love to hear from you as to how it's going if you've tried this with your students. I've been using this with my students for 2 years now, and I find it really effective, especially the part about getting my students to analyze machine translation and getting them to understand what kind of mistakes actually come up in the machine translation. So yeah, it can be a very useful exercise for your students. You could even just do that. And then you could say, please don't use machine translation. Look at all the mistakes it makes. I mean, you could just stop at that point. You don't have to use it in class. But my idea is that if you let students use it because it's already there, because they're already using it, let's get them to use it mindfully. Okay. All right. And that is the end of my presentation. But I would love to read your comments or questions, or if you'd like to turn off or turn on your microphone, turn on your camera, and ask me questions. I would love to take your questions.
Well, thank you, Susan. This is a very wonderful idea. I think I can use it. Hello, Susan. I'm Phoebe from National Taipei University. I really appreciate about this idea. I'm working my research focused on the Grammarly, how I can use and incorporate Grammarly in my class, and I'm running this for a long time. So I have a couple of questions that I would like to ask you. The first one is about your students' level. I want to know about how about your student level? Can they work on the machine translation? Do they understand about the comments? Can they take all this comment from the Grammarly? This is the first question. And the second one, I'm going to actually very interesting because it seems a very long process. They have before the writing, they have to do the pre-edit, and then they start to write the translate, and then they have the post-edit. That's a long process. So I want to know about your students' perception. What's their attitude?
Okay. Yeah, those are two really good questions. So I have to say that my students are intermediate to upper level English students. We use the TOEIC test in Japan. Are you familiar with the TOEIC test?
Yes.
Okay, so my students are mostly 500 and above of the TOEIC test. But I imagine it could be used with students who are slightly lower level. But as you mentioned, I think it's quite a fine line. You want students to have writing skills to begin with, right? You want them to have a basic knowledge of writing good English sentences, grammatically correct English sentences. So it is important to have that basis, that the basic English ability in order to use machine translation effectively, I think. As for this very long process, it's very long the first time you do it with your students. So when I did this with my students last semester, we took, I want to say 5 weeks of class, 5 classes. Our classes are 90-minute classes, so 5 90-minute classes to use and talk about machine translation. Okay, so we actually broke it down into those discrete steps and talked about it every week in class. So it is a long process, but once they understand it, then they can use it for their other writing classes pretty easily. They don't have to spend as much time like doing the error detection, for example. You only have to do that once to understand, okay, machine translation takes a long time. We can leave the error detection out of it. Honestly speaking, if you wanted to make the process shorter, you could also cut out the pre-edit stage. The pre-edit stage has a little bit of value. It's not super valuable. You can definitely correct those errors in the translation itself. So if you wanted to make the process a little bit shorter, you could cut out the pre-edit stage.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Oh, and about the last one, how about students' attitude? They feel happy about this?
They were shocked. They were shocked because most teachers will say, do not use machine translation in our class. And I teach translation, and I always say, do not use machine translation. And then suddenly I came in and said, you know what? Let's use machine translation.
More
Because
homework.
I realized that they're trying to use it anyway. They were trying to use it anyway.
Yes.
And if they're going to use it badly, that's not going to help them in any way. But if they can understand how to use it well, then that's a skill they can take with them to the workplace after they graduate. I imagine that even we teachers are using machine translation in order to read documents sometimes, or in order to write emails in our L2, in our second language. I certainly do. I'm the first person to admit it. If I have a 150-page dissertation to read in Japanese, yeah, I'm going to use machine translation the first time to read it. And it saves me time. It saves me a lot of time. And I imagine our students are doing the same thing. So reading skills aside, just looking at writing skills, I want my students to understand how to use it responsibly, how to use it well, because I think that's a great skill to give them. This is the future. They're going to use it anyway.
Future. I'll totally agree with that.
Yeah,
Well,
so they were pretty excited.
Yes. Well, maybe we'll just leave some time for teachers if they have any questions to machine translation.
Sure.
I'm gonna check.
If no one has a question, I would like to ask one, Susan. This is Brent. Yeah.
Hi.
I just wanted. Do you feel that this process helps your students improve their translation skills? Like, have you seen a noticeable difference after beginning using this?
Yes. They have become a lot more careful. They've become more attuned to their own mistakes in translation, and they've gotten used to this process of going back and checking line by line, and then overall, and then looking for the format. Whereas before, a lot of times they would do the translation and then just say, okay, I'm finished. I translated it beginning to end. Hi, I'm finished. And they'll hand it in without really going back and checking. And I think all teachers want their students to go back and check their writing before handing it in, right? We hate to see spelling mistakes. We hate to see, especially when the software tells us there's a problem. If you have a little red wavy line or a blue wavy line, that means there's a problem. And you need to make sure that you've dealt with it before you hand it in. I can say that until I'm blue in the face, but they don't do it. Yeah. And this sort of, this puts it in their mind that, hey, they really do need to check line by line several times, and then also looking at the entire format of the document. So I have seen a real improvement in translations from my students.
And you always use it from Japanese to English?
At this point, I have only used it Japanese to English, but I teach both directions, so that might be the next step for me.
Right, yeah. Actually, it reminds me, one time I had to submit an abstract for a conference in Japan, and I had to send a Japanese version as well, and I just used Google Translate to do the translation, and I submitted it, but the guy said, "Oh, your Japanese translation is very good." So I think that it can translate quite well from English to Japanese, I guess. Though I couldn't check it myself.
Right.
Yeah.
It does. There are specific errors that it makes going the opposite way. So, for example, in English, we use a lot of pronouns: he said, she said, whatever. but if you translate those directly into Japanese, it translates those pronouns. But in Japanese, we almost never use pronouns. It's very unusual. So as soon as I see an English to Japanese translation with too many pronouns, I know that they've probably used machine translation. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'll let someone else have a turn.
Okay.
Hey, Susan. This is Denise from National Taipei University as well.
Hello.
As you say that the student group that you used the machine translation are mainly intermediate level to advanced level. Will you suggest this technique to teachers who are teaching like students under intermediate level? Because it's going to be hard for students to go through the pre-editing stage.
Yes, I don't recommend the pre-editing stage for very low-level students. It's going to be a little bit too confusing. But with the lower-level students, what I do recommend doing is the error detection stage. Because I think that it's really important for all students to understand the types of errors that machine translation makes. And to be able and go through and find those errors is very, very helpful. It's very enlightening for the student. But I also think it's important for them to go beyond that and look at the contrastive rhetoric, the format of the way an article or an essay or a paper, an academic paper might be written. So with very elementary level English students, that might be getting a little bit difficult, but at the very bare minimum, I would ask students to do that error detection exercise because I think it would be very enlightening for them, very helpful for them to understand the types of errors. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm really curious to know if any of you care if your students use machine translation in order to do reading assignments, reading homework. They have something like maybe a long academic article they need to read in English, and they know it's going to take them hours and hours, just like me with a dissertation. Do you care if your students use machine translation to get through that article, to read for content?
Well, it's me again, Denise.
Yes.
No, I don't really mind if this would help them to understand the content of the reading first, and then I would ask them to go through it again to really match the translation in their language with the English. So through this, they can still learn how to translate it.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, I use it for reading myself. So I like to encourage my students to use it as a tool for understanding as well. I asked the question because I noticed that my talk today is part of a series. On the poster, it said the EMI lecture series. And so this is one of the tools that students in an EMI classroom who aren't necessarily studying English, but studying content in English, this is a really valuable tool for them, right? In addition to things like transcripts and subtitles, but also having permission to use machine translation in order to increase their understanding of the material, of the content, can be really, really helpful. So I was just wondering how everyone felt about that. How do you feel about giving your students explicitly giving your students permission to use machine translation in the classroom? Do you feel okay about it?
It all depends on if there's going to be like post-editing later on, will be like following up activities after that. If it's just translation without following steps, then I will not do it because students will not realize the purpose of doing it. They simply just find it a shortcut.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, excellent. Okay. Well, I do believe, though, that if you give them permission to use it, but you also guide them through these steps and show them how to use it properly, that it can be very useful for them. And the quality of their output, the quality of their writing really does go up. And everyone wins. Everyone wins. That it gives them the ability to start looking at issues that often get put off or ignored completely. So things like contrastive rhetoric, or things like formatting the writing for its intended purpose. So if it's a newspaper article, how do we write newspaper articles in English? Oh, they should be formatted this way. They should be written in this order. It allows students to just go beyond, take a step beyond just getting it right grammatically in English, and it lets them enter a different area of writing, an upper level of English writing, I think.
Yeah, true. Yeah, totally agree.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, are there any other questions?
Yeah, I'd just like to say something else. Susan, it's Brent again. Yeah, I just want, do you think the students could become dependent on the machine translation?
Yeah, I suppose so. Sure, why not? Like any other tool. How dependent are we now on electronic dictionaries and on spell check and on any of these other tools that we've very much come to depend on? I certainly do. I'm a terrible speller. I depend very highly on spell check.
Yeah, I think my spelling ability has declined in the past years because of that. Yeah. But do you have
your ability to write Chinese characters, right, by hand? I can barely write Japanese by hand anymore because I do it all on my phone or on the computer. So my ability to write is almost gone. Does that mean I'm not a good communicator? No, I don't think so.
Yeah. So when you have exams, do you allow the students to use devices?
I do. I actually teach in a call classroom, and I have my students on the computer constantly for my translation classes. Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I see someone put a question in the comments section. You see the message.
Besides Grammarly, thank you for your question, Grace. Besides Grammarly, what other grammar check tools do you recommend? Actually, I recommend Grammarly. I think it's the best one I've tried, but there are other free ones, and you can Google them. You can do a search and just put in free grammar checker, and you'll get 100 hits. There are many of them. Instead of translating large blocks of text, have you ever tried letting students do the writing first and then make use of machine translation only for phrases they're not sure of? No, actually, I haven't done that, but that's a really interesting idea. I like that a lot. That could work. I think that could be a really fun writing exercise. Why not? Since I teach translation and not writing, not writing from scratch writing, I haven't done that, but I think that's a fabulous use of machine translation and just another great example of how it can be used effectively in class or as part of their homework. Yeah. Thank you, Grace. Yeah, sure. Any other questions? You can either turn off your mic or you can put them in the chat.
Well, we're close to the time, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Well, thank you for this presentation today. I really learned a lot. I think my student will get excited for how many homework they got this time. I'm going to incorporate what you just say for the pre-edit, and then they can run about like machine translation. I incorporate a lot of the Grammarly in my writing, and especially that this is a very good tool. I want them to know about the tool, how they can use it, not just in the classroom, but outside the classroom. Well, for all the teachers, Susan is very kind and very generous. She left her email. So if you have any question that you would like to ask Susan, you can email her. Or of course, like if you have any things like related to machine translation, of course, Susan can answer the questions. Well, another issue here, before you leave, we have the questionnaire. Leslie, can you help us to post the link? Yes. So teacher, can you help us to fill out the survey question here to let us know about like what you think about the presentation, what all the issues that you would like to know about. So once again, on behalf of the Language Center, I would like to thank Susan for this wonderful session. Thank you, Susan.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
And thank you.
Everyone, please keep in touch if you use this in class. Let me know how it goes and how you use it. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That's a very wonderful one.
Keep in touch.
Keep in touch. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye.